Good morning, readers. This is an introduction to strategy journals. Strategy journals are a specific kind of metacognitive journal that are more targeted and focused than our more general metacognitive journals, where you can pick different sentence frames and reflect on a topic of your choosing. A key understanding that we want to get right at the beginning of today's lesson is that when you practice strategies that you learn each week in class, you become a faster and more accurate reader. Say you're learning this week about using context or context clues. What a strong reader will do on that week when they've learned to use context clues and they've seen examples is that they will go and practice using that specific strategy during their own reading for fun or reading for pleasure. And so what a strategy journal does is it tries to capture that process of taking something you learned in class and applying it to your reading at home. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at an example to see how it works. Today, when I sat down for 15 or 20 minutes for my practice home reading, I was reading, and on page 93 of my book, which is by a guy named Mortimer Adler, I found a paragraph that I thought was important, but also very confusing. And so I've chosen it today as my roadblock that I want to journal about, because I want to try to use this week's strategy, which is using context. I want to try to use the strategy I learned in class for a real life roadblock I found in my book. So for your convenience in this video, I've gone ahead and I've blown up the paragraph that was confusing for me, and I've put it here on the screen. Now, specifically, what I didn't understand from this paragraph was that in this sentence, the author mentions that we should do something. And I wasn't sure exactly what he meant. Do what? He seems very persuasive. He wants us to take action and to do something, but I was a bit lost there. I also noticed that he says the most efficient kind of reading. So for me, the word efficient was a roadblock. I wasn't sure exactly what he meant by that word in this sentence. Now, by using the bubble of context, which I've learned this week as a useful strategy, I decided to look in the paragraph around the roadblock for any potential clues or hints. What I ended up finding was that the very sentence before the roadblock actually mentions him wanting us to do something specifically. He says, I want to persuade you to write between the lines. And then he says, unless you do. So I can actually make a reasonable prediction that what he wants us to do is write between the lines. Now, what does that mean? I'm not actually quite sure yet. I don't think he's explained it. I'm going to assume that that comes up in a later paragraph. But at least I know what he means when he's saying the word do. Now, for the second roadblock, I'm looking at the paragraph above for more clues, and I notice the words important, and I notice getting the most out of anything, and I notice how he wants to persuade us to do something. And so I'm going to assume that by taking his advice, the word efficient must mean something good. It must be like a word that means like it'll make you stronger, or it'll make you better, or it'll make you faster. Why do I guess that these are the three possible meanings? It's all of these details in the paragraph above that kind of inspired me to make that prediction. Now, one of the most important skills that we're building throughout this course is taking our invisible thinking, which happens here in our head, and putting it visibly onto paper. In order to capture my invisible thinking in a visible way, I've gone ahead and I've written a weekly journal entry about that roadblock that I clarified. As you listen to this read aloud, try to notice, where do I include details or examples or explanations that help the reader understand how I problem solve from being confused to being not confused. Let's go ahead and let's take a look. While I was reading, I felt confused when I read the line, unless you do, you are not likely to do the most efficient kind of reading, end quote, page 93. This confused me because Adler says to do something, but I don't know what. I also don't understand when he says, quote, doing it will be the most, quote, efficient kind of reading. What does that mean? So I decided to reread and use context clues. I remember that earlier in the paragraph, he wrote how he wants to persuade us to, quote, write between the lines. It's the very next sentence that he says, quote, unless you do, blah, blah, blah. So maybe this is what he's asking us to do, to write in the books we read. I also figured out that efficient must mean something good or positive, because earlier he says his tip was, quote, important to our reading, end quote. So efficient might be like a stronger reading maybe. That would make sense because he's trying to persuade or help us become better. Now, again, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to capture my thought process, which all happened inside my mind, in words on paper. Now, there were a couple of tricks that I used to help make my thinking very clear for my audience. You'll notice that in purple, I've included sentence frames that build metacognition, that focus the reader on my type of thinking and how my brain worked. In red, you'll notice that I'm lifting up specific text details or quotes or words that were part of my thought process. For example, I mentioned the context clues that actually stuck out to me as being helpful for my problem. And in green, I've even gone ahead and labeled the strategies that I noticed myself using while I was trying to problem solve today. Now, you don't have to color code your journal entries when you write them, but it is important to consider if you have metacognitive focuses, whether you have textual details, and whether you have named and reflected on the strategies your mind was using during that reading today.